Hello and welcome to this Spectator Alternative Conference event on Britain's housing crisis and tackling intergenerational unfairness in the wake of COVID-19. I think lockdown made everyone acutely aware of people's housing situation. You had older people, older professionals tending to have houses with gardens, with space, and able to actually kind of find some comfort in their garden, in their space that they had, while as young Londoners had on average 9.3 square metres of personal space, roughly the size of a prison cell. So lockdown really did feel like lockdown to them. So the question is, how do we solve this problem? How do we get more houses built? Something this country has struggled to do for decades now. I'm joined today by an absolutely fantastic panel to discuss this. We have Kate Henderson, the Chief Executive of the National Housing Federation. Bob Blackman, the Tory MP for Harrow East, who's done amazing work on homelessness and is also the Secretary of the very powerful 1922 Committee. And by John Myers, who's the co-founder of YIMBY, which stands for Yes in My Backyard, the opposite of NIMBYs. Now, the way we're going to do this is Kate and Bob and John are all going to speak for a few minutes at the beginning, and then we're going to throw it open. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion with the panel, and then we're going to throw it open to your questions. So, Kate, do you want to take us away?
Brilliant. Thank you, James, and good morning, everybody. So I run an organisation called the National Housing Federation. We're the voice of housing associations in England. Our members manage and own around 2.5 million properties, providing homes to around 6 million people in England. As James said, the pandemic has really revealed the inequality in housing in Britain. And for many of us, our homes have been our place of work, they've been our place of homeschooling, they've been our sanctuaries. And as James said, for others, it has simply been like living in a prison. And for at the really sharp end of the housing crisis, actually having no home at all. We did some research a couple of months ago looking at people's housing conditions during the height of lockdown. And our survey found that nearly 1 in 3 people experienced either mental or physical health problems because of their housing conditions. If you look at the English Housing Survey, you can see that a record 3.7 million people are living in overcrowded homes, including 1.6 million children. And by overcrowding, you know, this isn't just kids sharing a bedroom, it's children sharing bedrooms with parents, parents sleeping in bathrooms and hallways and kitchens, homes that are simply too small to meet their needs. We know that 30,000 people spent lockdown in a single room as their home, and what that must have felt like. And we have over 62,000 families in temporary accommodation. So we have a huge housing crisis. And I think these statistics really reveal the pressures on individuals and on families during lockdown, and really highlight the need to have investment in social housing. And why investment in social housing, and why now? Because we are in a recession. We are seeing housing starts fall, and we are seeing the need for safe, secure, affordable housing grow. If we invest in social housing now, it would boost the economy, it would sustain thousands of jobs, it would support supply chains, and it would provide homes for millions of people who need them. So that's my opening gambit, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. Bob, do you want to chip in?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, James, and thank you, Kate, for that introduction. I think the reality is that in this country, we haven't built enough housing for 30 years, and the estimates are that we need to build 300,000 new homes every year just to catch up. And certainly we're going to need to do that for the next 5 years. At the same time, planning permission has been granted for more than 1 million homes in this country that are unbuilt. So we have those 3-4 years of potential development already in the pipeline. The big concern is they're not being built. So we have to remove the barriers to actually building them. I think the other issue which we're covering, obviously during lockdown, is the number of people that have been either required to work from home or have chosen to work from home during this pandemic. And we have to think of the design of homes as well. So the first thing is, you know, if you're one person living in a 1-bedroom flat, you've probably got space in which to work. But if there's a couple of you and you're both working from home, what's the impact of that? And more importantly, probably, if you're a family, where do the kids do their homework and so on? So one of the things that we have to, I think, adjust our thinking now is that in the new normal, more people will work from home more often. That doesn't mean to say people will work from home permanently and never go into a place of work, but those that can work from home, I think, are far more likely to be able to work from home because of the new technology. The other point that I would just make about how we get more homes built is the public sector have got to stop selling land with respect to developers. What we've got to do is use that public land to develop the housing, the social housing, as Kate says. I take the view of 100,000 units a year for the next 5 years. So there are so affordable homes that people can choose to rent and to part buy. So we would have if I was in a position to set this policy, I would say we build those homes. You can exercise the right to a shared ownership on day one. But if you don't do that, you'll have a guaranteed price that you can buy that home over the next 5 years and exercise that option at any one time. All those proceeds from the sale of those homes should then go into the building of new social rented accommodation. Now, the beauty of this is it would lead to a position of providing the housing that we need. It would make the housing affordable for people rather than having to rely on benefits, because I think that's one of the big challenges that we've seen, that people just, particularly during this lockdown, have really struggled in order to pay their rent and pay their way. I think that's the key for me. The price of land is so expensive now, it's holding back the development of new housing.
Thank you so much, Bob. John, over to you.
So our YIMBY campaigns are pushing for plentiful, well-designed homes with the support of local people. And this country has the best housing heritage in the world, centuries of stunning buildings, but we've let down the ambitions of our predecessors. You know, as Bob says, since the Second World War, we've never grown the housing stock at the rate we did in the 1830s, never mind the 1930s. And so as a result, most young people have given up on the chance of ever owning a home. The eminent economic historian, Professor Nicholas Crafts, estimated we could boost GDP by literally 20%, and so overtake Germany in value added per head just by building the right kinds of homes in the right places. But for decades, we've built mainly poorly designed homes, nowhere near enough of them within reach of jobs people want to take, with high wage firms who want to hire, and bad planning has led to horrible regional imbalances and lack of opportunity, not to mention, of course, poor housing. Now, the government's planning white paper aims to fix all that while making the planning system more predictable. And the devil's in the details, but for me, the most exciting idea in the white paper was reviewed on the Spectator's website last month, and it's an idea we've been pushing for some time, to let residents of a single street decide for themselves what designs of additional development to permit. So in some cases, a street of drab 1950s bungalows might jointly decide to give permission for beautiful terraced houses or stunning mansion blocks instead, adding many more homes and making each of those homeowners an overnight millionaire. And that idea has been supported by people including the Royal Town Planning Institute, Nicholas Boys Smith of Create Streets, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and the late Sir Roger Scruton. That reform has the potential to allow millions more homes where needed without touching the countryside, while improving those streets, making the homeowners happier and boosting growth. And that would finally let us give all young people a fair chance of good jobs and the homes they need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bob, if I can start with you. So what you're essentially talking about is direct commissioning. The states.
Indeed. Yes, I am. Yeah. I think the problem is that, 5-6 years ago, there was a deliberate decision by George Osborne and David Cameron to divert housing money into building housing for first-time buyers. Now, we need to do that as well, don't get me wrong, but it meant that the social housing programme was basically decimated. And what we also know is, unfortunately, this leads to an unvirtuous cycle, whereby basically the public land is sold for private development, private developers come in, they sell the land on and on and on, and eventually something gets built. And then they say, we can't build the social housing that was part of the original planning permission. So we have to build it for profit. people can't afford to buy those properties, so private developers can't buy the properties, then rent them out. The people that move in can't afford the rents, so they then claim housing benefit. So that actually we end up subsidising people's rents. It's far better, in my view, to have rents that people can afford to pay from their pay packets rather than subsidising housing in the way that we've chosen to do so. The other benefit, of course, of doing it this way is I'm only talking about on public land, by the way. So it's publicly owned land already. The benefit of doing that is that we will get direct commissioning and far faster development of the housing. We're not in a position whereby we can afford the private sector, I'm afraid, to develop the housing that we need, because they will undoubtedly ration supply to maximize profits. And I don't blame them, because they're private companies. But we can't afford for this country to continue on this basis.
So yeah, the oligopoly of housing developers, just they want to just drip things onto the market rather than do anything that might actually reduce the price. Kate, where do you stand on that as an idea?
So I think that Bob's idea of using public sector land to deliver a social good, which is social housing, makes a huge amount of sense. And what Bob was saying is actually diverting money away from the housing benefit bill, but into rents that are actually genuinely affordable. So a social rent is typically 50% of a market rent, down to about 30% in London and maybe up to 60% in the northeast. But it isn't just that, it's the stability it offers. So that, if you're a child right now living in overcrowding or in the private rented sector, or worse still in temporary accommodation, your education, your health, your life chances are so impacted by not having that stability, as well as, the affordability side of things. So I would fully support the use of public sector land to deliver social housing. And that isn't to say also that we don't fully support routes into home ownership. We do. It's just, how do we get best value for the economy and for society out of a public good, which is that public land.
John, I think a few months ago I would have agreed with almost everything you said, but I wonder whether there's an element that this current crisis has shifted things, which is, if we're now in a world of if you can have conference fringe events on Zoom, you can do most things on Zoom, that people aren't as wedded to having to live near big urban centres as they once were. But there is now more of a chance to say, classically the problem in this country has been, as the government is finding with its algorithm for determining housing need, is that when you try and work out where you need to build more houses, it tends to be London and the southeast, rather than the rest of the country. But is there not a case now that with so much of life moving online, with people maybe going to the office kind of once a week rather than every day, but there is actually an opportunity to say, look, people would actually rather live in some of these towns that have not had a great time in the last 20, 30 years, and there is a chance to kind of regenerate them rather than simply try to build more houses in the southeast.
So it's a great point, and I certainly agree that the pandemic has caused a step change in adoption of these sorts of technologies, video conferencing, and people are not probably going to be going into the offices as much as they did before. But I'm not sure they'll just be going in one day a week. In many cases, you might see a 20 or a 40% reduction in office usage. But I think most people will still be going to the office. I'm happy to bet in 2 years' time, the Spectator will still be attending physical party conferences. So I'll be interested to hear if you take that bet. And so I don't think distance is going away. And so I think the critical question is, how do we best help the sorts of places you've talked about? And actually, unfortunately, the planning system has hurt them, because if you ban offices and housing where the jobs are, essentially you create a sorting effect. And let me take an example. After the Black Death in 1348, the aristocracy went to the king and said, we don't want the labourers moving around in this newfound shortage of labour, because they're going to demand higher wages. And so the king actually banned labourers moving around the country. It's the statute of labourers. And that's unfortunately what we've done by planning, and it's kept wages artificially low in many of these regions.
Bob, to move back from 1348 to the present day, when you look at the trouble that is being caused by this, planning algorithm among some of your colleagues. It slightly makes one despair, doesn't it? Because the simple basis of the formula is that you need to build the most houses where housing is least affordable compared to wages. But that seems to bring out a lot of your colleagues in hives. I mean, are we ever going to build enough houses if that remains the case?
Well, I think whenever you construct an algorithm to determine how things are going to work, there are a number of factors that go into that algorithm. As you quite rightly say, what is being determined at the moment is the areas with the most expensive housing have to take the most property development. I think the big problem that we've got with these proposals is that some of the areas, for example, in London, just to give you an example, Barnet, the borough of Barnet, and I don't have any connection with the borough of Barnet, I have to add, have been told they've been the most successful developers of new housing in London. And they've been told to treble the amount that they will have to build. I mean, what that means is that there's only one place to go, and that's upwards in terms of tower blocks. Now, that actually then leads to the destruction of suburbia as we know it. And so I think our problem is not so much this algorithm, it's understanding that things have changed because of this pandemic. As you quite rightly say, people can choose to live, I mean, if they want to, probably on an island in Scotland, if they want to, and still be able to work in London because of the fact that they could work from home. So people can choose now to work from home, and they may choose, and this is something we need to consider now, they may choose to commute far longer distances for the 1 or 2 days a week that they come into an office, as opposed to the daily grind of having to travel every single day. And I think this is something that is going to be important. Equally, the other challenge I think we have is that in our towns and cities, because I predict there'll be less of a demand for office space and traditional workspace, actually, with appropriate controls, we can change those offices. We've got many homes that have been converted into offices, particularly in London. Why not convert them back to homes where people can live in them, and we can repopulate our towns and cities, and then people will be able to walk to work, which always used to be the case.
Okay, well, where do you stand on that? This idea of you know, if the banks are all going to require less office space, you know, why not turn some of those big tower blocks in Canary Wharf into homes? Well, where are you on that question?
So I think converting office buildings into homes or former other types of commercial premises can be a really good, sustainable thing to do, depending on how you do it. So it can be perfectly sustainable to look at a building and think, you know, what should its future use be? And we've seen that with religious buildings, with theatres, with office buildings. But it's how you do it and the quality of what you end up with. And at the moment, we have a policy called permitted development, where you can convert commercial buildings into residential with a prior approval process, but without a full planning permission. And we've got some real concerns about that because of some of the quality of the homes that's being created in terms of space, lack of access to windows, and some really basic things that haven't been considered, like where will children play if they're going straight out onto a street, or how do they get to school, or is there public transport, that kind of thing. So if we are going to be thinking about the future of our high streets and our inner city areas and buildings where perhaps there are less people going into work and converting them, let's not do that outside of planning. Let's do that in a really creative way that creates high quality environments and ensures that people have a say over what's in there, that we get a good social mix, that you get a proportion of affordable housing, all of those things that are not possible with permitted development. So yes, changing use of buildings can be great, but not outside of planning through.
You seem to be more sceptical than the other panelists that this pandemic is going to lead to lasting change. I get the impression that you think as soon as there's a vaccine or some kind of mass spit testing program, we'll be back to the way we always were, and life will return to kind of pre-COVID levels pretty quickly. Am I accurately summarising your view here?
Not quite. I mean, I'm certainly not saying we'll go back to the way things were. There's been a step change. People have spent a lot of money and time getting used to new technology. We have an airline pilot on our panel right now who's an expert in all of this. And so there's definitely been an acceleration of the trend that we saw to people working more away from the office. But I don't think the office is dead. People get tired of Zoom conferences. They want to be able to shake hands with people. They want to catch the nuances that you get from face to face. And so the technology just isn't there yet to abolish distance. It might be one day, but I'm afraid it's not quite there yet.
Brilliant. Well, we've got some very interesting questions coming in. I'm going to start with one from Miles saying that the EWS1 cladding scandal is holding up everything, even on safe flats. This is the requirement for post-Grenfell Tower and that awful fire for buildings to be certified safe and for any unsafe cladding to be removed. How can we break this bureaucratic deadlock? Bob, do you want to tackle that one?
Yes, thanks, James. I sit on the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. We are doing, at the moment, free legislative scrutiny on the draft safety bill. And we are, I'm afraid, every week discovering more aspects of this. I mean, this current position over certification of properties being safe is I'm afraid, the tip of an iceberg. Well, we do have a problem about the number of qualified people in this country to actually go around, do the inspections, do the surveys, and then sign off something as safe. We also have a huge backlog in the wake of Grenfell of unsafe cladding, and it's not just ACM cladding; it's other types of cladding as well that have been put on buildings, signed off under existing building regulations, and then now they've just been discovered to be unsafe. And one of the problems is that the testing regime that we have for cladding and other purposes is not fit for purpose and has got to be changed, and it's got to be made much more transparent and obvious to people. So how do we break that logjam? Well, for a start, we've got to get more people qualified to be able to do this job of going around and signing them off, because I feel really sorry for any leaseholders in these properties, because at the moment, basically, they will not be able to sell their property. Their property is probably worthless as a result of this position. We've got to urgently get people up to speed in order to get this done. I'm afraid there isn't a quick fix on this particular issue, and that's one of the problems. But I think everyone deserves to know that they are living in a safe building, because at the moment, the backlog on removing cladding is far too great. Fixing this problem has been far too slow. And to be fair, the government has allocated the money to start doing this. It's actually getting the money spent is the biggest problem at the moment within the industry, and providing the safe cladding that everyone needs, because there's a reason for having cladding in the first place.
Kate, do you want to comment on this?
Yes, please. So I think agree with everything Bob's just said, and the safety of residents has got to be the #1 priority. It's a huge priority for us and our members, specifically on the EWS1 issue, which is the external wall system certification issue. Only the government has the power to unstick this. This is a situation where we are doing work as fast as we possibly can, but we have not got access to enough experts to do the work, but also those forms are now being required on buildings that are not high-rise buildings. We've even heard them being required from some mortgage lenders on brick buildings, townhouses, which don't require them. So we need the government to act really quickly on this to resolve this. But it is broader than, so that's an immediate issue with kind of unsticking those building, the mortgage market actually, of people remortgaging, people trying to sell, huge numbers of people, and you'll see it day in and day out in the press now of people trapped in flats, unable to move to their next home, and also people unable to buy. There is also a wider building safety programme, as Bob has said, so it's not just about those forms, it's a much bigger issue, and we do need the government to lead a coordinated building safety programme, and that must mean prioritising those buildings that are highest risk first, but absolutely also working across industry to ensure we've got enough resources and enough experts to do the work. And the reason we need that national prioritisation is otherwise everybody is competing for the same pool of scaffolders, of cherry pickers, of experts, and actually it drives up cost, but it means we're not tackling those buildings that are most at risk first. I also agree with Bob that these costs should not fall on residents, whether they are renters, whether they're leaseholders, but I also don't think that they should fall on not-for-profit charitable housing associations. The government has produced some funding. We have an ACM cladding fund, which has been hugely important, and the social housing sector is really working very, very hard on the ACM remediation of tall buildings. We have a new building safety fund, but actually housing associations, unless they are claiming for the leaseholder part, are not eligible for that fund. So there's not a level playing field with that. And I think, as Bob said, the money's not going out fast enough, but actually the demand for that fund, when we see the outcome of it, I think is going to be far higher than the amount that's available. And so we also need to think about long-term financial solutions to ensure that the work happens quickly, that it's prioritised, but also that those costs and those burdens do not fall on residents, whether they're renters or leaseholders.
John, I think this is a question for you. And is house design the most important thing to consider when looking to build new properties? And this has been a definite shift in recent years. You had Nick Bowles, when he was housing minister, saying that the reason people were so opposed to new housing developments was that we were building ugly rubbish. And then this government obviously had the late Roger Scruton do a whole commission on architecture on building beautiful, in the belief that if you built tree-lined streets with attractive properties, more people would become like you, YIMBYs rather than NIMBYs. Do you think design is the most important thing to consider?
Well, I'm sure Bob will be the first to tell you that design is not the only thing that gets people concerned about new development. Certainly bad design doesn't help, and there's no reason why anybody should have to have bad design. But there are a whole range of other things that people get concerned about. They get concerned about parking, traffic, noise, congestion of local health services. So these are all of the things we need to address if we're going to solve the problem of opposition to new housing, and the white paper tries to do that.
Bob, how do you feel about it? It does feel something slightly out of revolutionary France, a kind of state-designed, approved set of beautiful buildings to be designed. I mean, where are you on this question? Does your free market soul reject it or not?
No, far from it. I welcome the provision of tree-lined streets with two-storey housing. The reality is that a lot of the proposals in the white paper are not going to lead to that. They're going to lead to high-rise, high-density blocks of flats without proper garden space for children to play in, and without people being able to actually enjoy the benefits of their homes. And that's my principal concern with currently with the housing white paper. I mean, just give you quite an example. Two examples that I think are very important here. We've got the Oxford to Cambridge corridor, which is purportedly going to take 1 million new homes over an extended period of time. And all sorts of proposals are being put on that. Should we have a network of villages or new towns along there? Or should it be one conglomerate development all the way along for all that distance? And the other is what's going on in London right now. What's going on in the suburbs in London is every development is big 20, 30, 40 stories of housing, which frankly, I've yet to meet anyone who actually wants to live in these places. They may be forced to live in them because there's nowhere else, but they would certainly not exercise that as a choice. And I think it's choice in housing that we're going to have to get used to. And I agree with John. One of the problems in all this development is we get incremental development. So it's, well, this isn't quite enough to justify a new school. It isn't quite enough to justify new medical facilities. And by the way, what we're going to do is cramp it down so there's no parking available. And what goes on in the suburbs in particular is that people still own cars. They just park them in residential streets and overload those residential streets. So I think we actually have to get some common sense in this whole basis. And that's why it's important to consult local people and get their buy-in before development takes place on any planning application.
And do you think this has got, I mean, government ministers would say that the link up between provision of schools and hospitals and housing has got better in recent years. Is that your experience?
No, I mean, I think that the reality is that if you're building a brand new estate with hundreds of new homes, then that will get planned into it. without doubt. The big problem is that, generally speaking, planning authorities are dealing with what I would call incremental growth, so that you'll get a block of flats or a street of homes, and it's not enough to justify, certainly not enough to justify a new school. And then suddenly you've allowed all this development to take place, and there is no space for that new school. There is no space for that medical centre. And I think that's something that has to be taken into account. So local authorities should be planning strategically for, if we're going to allow this type of development, then we're going to need a new school or expand existing schools. We're going to need a new medical centre. We're going to need community facilities. We're going to need shops. You name it, we're going to need it, as opposed to just allowing the development to proceed willy-nilly.
Right. Kate, does Britain need more Poundbury's?
I don't know if it needs more Poundbury's, but I think new communities should be part of the solution. I think that we need urban regeneration. I think we need growth within our cities. I think we do need growth within our suburbs, but it should be done with good design and placemaking, and that does not always mean building up. You can do some fantastically high density, but really, really well-designed communities that are actually 2 or 3 story high, that there is access to gardens. It isn't always about the tower block. And it is about understanding how people want to live and how they're going to want to live as their families grow and change. But saying that, I do think new communities are going to be part of the solution. We have, as Bob said, we need to build 300,000 homes a year, roughly 100,000 of those to be social. We can't do that within the confines of our existing cities and towns. And so it's about finding those sustainable locations where you've got transport links, where you've got the ability to plan in and build, opportunities for work, for school, for health, all of those things, and doing that really, really well. But not, as Bob says, doing everything in kind of piecemeal, add-on, bolt-on estate that never quite kind of gets you the infrastructure that you need to get people to feel part of a community. So it is actually about more planning, not less planning. But and whether it's Poundbury or not, if a community decides that that's the aesthetic they want to go for, why not? But actually, there's loads of other creative ways of designing places, and I think I like the word beauty. I think we should be talking about beautiful places, but it isn't just about aesthetic.
So we've got a question here from Grace. She says, why don't we lift the new eviction rule? This will limit mass homelessness. Bob, you've done a lot of work on homelessness and getting rough sleepers into permanent accommodation and moving towards a kind of housing first strategy.
Yeah.
Do you think that's right, that lifting this no eviction rule would limit mass homelessness?
I think one of the things you can say is that the government did a brilliant job over the pandemic to take literally 15,000 people off the streets and put them into accommodation on a temporary basis. I have been arguing with ministers about what we do going forward, because obviously those people are going to come back out of that temporary accommodation and they desperately need somewhere to live. By definition, they didn't have anywhere to live to start with. So we have that set of people who have to be provided with a suitable home as fast as possible. The other issue is, of course, the moratorium we had on evictions during the pandemic. Now, there was justification for this, but my big concern, well, I have a number of concerns, but the biggest concern is that in this country, the private sector has been required almost to take over what the social sector used to do, and that is provide housing for people that don't have it. Equally, the figures are something like 90-odd% of private rented sector homes are owned by people that own 1 or 2 properties. They depend on that income from their rent for those properties. And equally, the tenancies generally are 6-month assured short-hold tenancies. So we're in the position now whereby since March, we've got to a position whereby virtually every tenancy in this country has expired. At which point, what does the landlord do? What we will lead to at the moment is a position whereby the landlord, if they issue a tenancy, will also issue a 6-month notice to quit, because the government is requiring them to basically to give 6 months notice. So they renew the tenancy and give them 6 months notice to quit. And the big problem, as I see it, is the number of people who are renting properties who basically have decided, I don't need to pay my rent because you can't evict me. And a large number of private sector owners now are struggling because tenants are just refusing to pay their rent, and of course the government said you can't evict them. Now we've got removed the moratorium on evictions, and I think for the most egregious cases that's absolutely right, so that people that suffer have caused antisocial behaviour, domestic violence, or otherwise broken the tenancy agreement are prioritised. But it is still an absolute nightmare for a private sector landlord to get an eviction, particularly on the grounds of rent arrears. And I think it's a real problem that the government has stored up. And by the way, I have been saying this to ministers ever since this started, that we need a plan for what we do. And it's no good coming to the crisis that we did the August bank holiday weekend when the moratorium was coming to an end. And ministers just extended that moratorium for a month. That's not a plan. That's dealing with a crisis and papering it over. What we have to have is a long-term plan for what we do with the private rented sector. And the reality is the other issue that I've highlighted is that those people that are on housing benefit or universal credit should have their rent paid direct to the landlords, which would then at least reduce the impact of rent arrears that they're suffering from, and make sure that the landlords were getting at least an income stream. Probably wouldn't be complete, as Kate said, it probably only covers part of the rent, but at least the rent arrears would be reduced. And then we have to get back to the position of saying, look, the courts have a process. The other issue, which I know I'm taking a bit of time here, James, but you asked a very complex question here. The other issue is that as things stood in the summer, if a case came in front of a judge and someone owed more than 8 weeks rent, then the judge had no choice whatsoever but to award a possession order to the landlord, which would mean that the tenant was going to be out on their ears. Now, these cases have to be looked at individually, because some people have literally had no income since March when the lockdown started, particularly if they changed jobs, particularly if they were self-employed, they weren't getting the support. And the issue then is, were they getting any money towards their rent or not? In which case the government has to look at this in the round on these people. There are others that quite frankly have just played the system and refused to pay their rent. Well, I have no sympathy for those people whatsoever. They've had the money, they've had the funding, and they should have paid their rent, in which case they should suffer the consequences through the courts of not paying their rent. But that's individual judgments have to be made on this. But we are on course at the moment for a major problem, because there's the estimates are 350,000 people are in rent arrears right now, and potentially could be evicted when the moratorium completely ends.
Well, if Baroness Stroud was on this panel, one of the architects of universal credit, she would say that it's a feature, not a bug in universal credit, that the rent is not paid directly to a landlord. Her argument would be that, in the same way that owner-occupiers pay their mortgage out of their salary, you should be helping people to learn how to budget by having them pay their landlord for their rent, rather than the state doing so directly. Well, what would you say to that argument?
No, yeah, and I think the design of universal credit was absolutely right. It is to get people to take personal responsibility for the lives that they lead. Many of the people that are on universal credit, particularly the people that have been homeless, have led chaotic lives, and therefore need to understand what it's like to receive a salary and manage their money, which is absolutely right. However, we have a pandemic, the like of which we've never seen in our lifetimes. And I do think that there's a problem here. Under normal circumstances, I would say, no, pay the money to the tenant. They must then exercise their duty, and that is to pay their rent and manage their finances. We're in a position whereby a lot of people have reached the stage of saying, oh, I can't manage my finances, and should I pay my rent, or should I buy food for the kids? I mean, this is the real problem here, that people are in a position whereby they cannot manage. And so I would say, look, in these circumstances, and for a limited period of time, then that money should automatically go to the landlord to at least safeguard their housing. Because we're paying, the taxpayer is paying this money for the rent, and therefore the rent must go to the landlord. And if it doesn't, then we are potentially risking the people that are investing in property and letting it out, which will be a complete disaster, because many of those people have chosen that route to supplement their pensions, and therefore they're suffering from not getting the money that they're due. So I think this is I understand completely the design. It's one I support strongly, but I do think that in these particular circumstances, we have to take stringent action.
Kate, where do you stand on this evictions question?
So I think Bob's really clearly illustrated the difference between private renting and social renting. So in terms of the evictions ban, we welcomed that, and as a sector we made an absolute commitment that ahead of the evictions ban coming in about 6 months ago, but made an absolute commitment that no resident would be evicted due to the pandemic causing them to be in rent arrears. And we've worked incredibly closely, our members, with their residents in terms of hardship funds, supporting residents to access the welfare that they're entitled to and helping them navigate that system. In tribute to DWP, and they have had a tremendous amount of pressure on them over the last 6 months. They have processed millions of claims, and they've worked really closely with the sector. They've also done a couple of things that have really helped support residents. So an additional £20, which does go towards food, has been vitally welcome in terms of the universal credit allowance during this time. But they've also made changes to the payment system. So there's a new and improved payment system for social landlords where you can have a direct payment to the landlord of the housing benefit, or the universal credit housing benefit portion of that. And that's really helped us sustain tenancies. It's helped support, it's being rolled out at the moment, but it's helping support those social residents manage their income, protect their livelihoods and sustain their tenancies. It is very, very different to the private rented sector. And I think it just kind of illustrates how they are quite different things. So the private rented sector is being used as a safety net for people who'd be so much better off in social rent, that they would get that support. And I absolutely hear what Bob's saying around those private sector landlords, many of which have one home and it's their income too, and now in a very tricky position. So there needs to be rental rights, rent protection for those renters, but there also needs to be protection for those landlords. But it's very, very different in the social housing sector. Just also on the evictions, whilst we did support the ban, we've also supported it being lifted. And that is all because of the points that Bob raised as well, that evictions are a last resort, but when you're in lockdown and somebody is doing antisocial behaviour and it's affecting you in your home, your community, it's horrendous. And there needs to be a tool to be able to prevent that. And similarly with domestic violence, there has got to be a mechanism for getting a perpetrator out of a home. But that is exceptional circumstances for us, and our sector is not using it for rent arrears.
Brilliant. John, we've got a question here about rent in London becoming unaffordable for young people. I mean, that comes back to the point you were making right at the beginning about regional inequality and what the planning system can do to address that. The government talks a lot about levelling up. How do you see that interaction between levelling up and planning? What are the steps that need to be taken to begin to reduce some of the house price discrepancy between the various regions of the country?
Well, the typical home in London has a price which is probably something like 4 times what it would actually cost to build that home. Now, there are a number of factors in that, but the biggest factor by far is the difficulty of finding land that you're allowed to build more homes on. And so over time, with a better planning system, we could get rents in London to a much more affordable level, which would reduce the amount of housing need, which is then met by people doing valuable jobs like Kate. And that increase in supply and market supply can be done without costing the government a penny. In fact, it will boost government revenues, because one of the ways to pay for this very expensive support that we as a society have deemed that we should provide to tenants and other people is growth. And we have this low-hanging fruit right there, where we could literally boost growth by 2 percentage points a year for a decade by fixing planning and paying, therefore, for all of the expensive things we've been doing. And how does that affect inequality? Well, if you let homes in London be built and the southeast be built so that over time they become more affordable, that will start to level out the discrepancies across the country. It will also let people move around more freely, so a young person growing up in the countryside can move to that job in Leeds that they want, or that job in Manchester or Birmingham, because it's the shortage of housing which is the biggest driver of that inequality.
What do you say to the question, I think, is this: how do you get sufficiently extra housing in London and the South East without building upwards in the way that Bob was worried about, you know, the way that basically destroys the character of these neighbourhoods?
So for us, the most popular thing we've come across is if you show people types of housing that they've seen in the past, whether they be terraced houses or perhaps mansion blocks. So think of Bath or Edinburgh, or all over the country, you'll see traditional types of housing, and they don't have to be a traditional design. You can have a contemporary street that's still walkable and people are happy to live in it. Those are the sorts of things that people are very happy to accept. And so that's why we think if we're going to add more homes, and if you don't want to touch more of the countryside, the easiest way to do that is to find ways that local residents can live with adding more of the types of things they're used to, townhouses and mansion blocks that don't stick up into the skyline. Which is not to say, by the way, I mean, I was talking with a housing campaigner yesterday who was very happy in her flat in the new 30-story tower she just moved into. So, I mean, there are people who want to live like that, but local people can get upset. So, but the easiest way to do, therefore, is to add more density in ways that everyone is already used to.
Do you think that this realistically, can this be done without building on bits of a green belt?
It would be possible to completely end the housing crisis without building on the green belt. Whether we will or not is an entirely different question, but you could easily add 5 million homes in London alone without touching a square inch of the green belt. Now, whether we can solve the political difficulties and whether we have the will to do that is an entirely different question.
Right. But because it does strike me that whenever I hear these plans, you know, if you're not going to even build on the green belt near commuter rail stations, for example, it strikes me that doesn't suggest you've necessarily got the kind of political will to build anywhere near the kind of 5 million houses that you're talking about in London and the South East.
So we suggested in 2017 a reform to let parishes decide to allow housing, well-designed housing that they liked on their own green belt, and the government adopted that in 2018 under constraints. There are a long list of parishes that would be delighted to add more housing on their own green belt, provided it's well-designed and it meets local needs, and they're being stopped by various layers of policy above that. So if we want to build on the green belt, the easiest and low-hanging fruit way to do it is to let them go forward with it.
Yeah, okay. Kate, we've got a question here for you from Joe, which probably will plunge fear into everyone who lives in London. Can we build downwards is the question.
I'm not sure I'm best equipped to answer that question in terms of building downwards. I think it comes back to how people want to live. So do people want to have daylight? And this isn't a technical response, it's just a human one. I can't imagine living somewhere where I don't have access to natural light. And I think everybody kind of needs that for their well-being. So I think there might be some opportunities to go down and certainly opportunities to go up, but it's about good placemaking, livable homes. And that's what beauty is for me, actually. A beautiful home is somewhere that's accessible, it's affordable to heat, you know, it's got enough space, it's got, you know, to do homework for the kids, you know, have bedrooms, but it's actually the fundamentals of kind of good design in terms of space and quality, and being part of a community where you've got kind of access to the things that you need, being able to walk to the pub or to go out for a bite to eat, being able to pop out and, you know, walk to get a pint of milk. Those kind of basics, I think, is what beauty is in terms of place, not just aesthetics. But in terms of going down, I don't know if that's the right solution for us.
And where do you stand on the question of how many of, you obviously represent people in social housing, do you think that the whole vision of the kind of property owning democracy, that the ultimate, you know, the classic Tory Thatcherite Macmillanite view, but the ultimate aspiration is home ownership, do you think that is now outdated, or do you think that is still, you know, what most of tenants in social housing would, you know, if their financial circumstances improve, would like to do?
So I think for a vast proportion of the population, people would love to own their own home, and they'd love to own their home with a bit of outdoor space, and they'd like it to be in an area where they had access to work and to schools. And but I think the reality is it's just really, really, really far out of reach for millions of people. And so what we need to do is ensure that everybody is well housed, whether they are social renting, private rented, or in some form of the housing ladder. But we have a huge need for social housing as part of that. Just because you're in social housing doesn't mean that you can't move out of it either. So I think as a sector, yes, we support the building of social homes, but we also are really positive about home ownership as well. It's absolutely not an either or, we need all of it, but it's, in terms of the government conversation, it's where they direct investment, but also where they direct investment right now in the midst of a pandemic and a recovery, because actually that building of private homes at the moment is going to be far harder in tougher economic circumstances, and you're subject to mortgage availability and everything else that's going on in the economy. Whereas we know there's absolute demand for social housing, and that we know that if we invest in that, we can sustain those jobs, we can sustain the supply chains, but also there's just a huge need for that type of home.
John, where do you stand on, Kate was talking about mortgage availability there. There is currently a kind of policy debate, which is, post 2008, there was a massive tightening up on the criteria for getting a mortgage. That again, banks are once more kind of reluctant to lend because they're kind of keen to preserve their capital in the current circumstance. There is a push now politically for a kind of return to kind of 5% mortgages, for just 5% deposit required. And the argument is that that would help more people get onto a housing ladder, that would stimulate more construction and the like. Where do you stand on that question?
So I think there are clearly people who are sufficiently creditworthy that they can be relied upon to repay a mortgage even if they only have a 5% deposit. But I think to a certain extent we're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic here. There is no need for this artificial limit on the number of homes that we're trying to dole out. And of course, the problem of affordability and home ownership varies around the country. So there are some parts, especially outside the southeast, where owning your home is much more affordable than it is in, say, Oxford or London. And that proves that we could do so much better if we tried. And
Kate, if you could do one, so your one policy would be the kind of direct commissioning of more social housing.
I think now, yeah, if I had to pick one thing, it would be direct investment in grant rates for social housing. And I think right now, given where we are in terms of economic uncertainty, having a sustained high level of investment in social rent would enable large construction sites to keep going. It would enable us as a sector to withstand the risk of a turbulent market cycle. So as Bob said also, we had a real reduction in funding for social housing from 2010 onwards. We have some funding now, but we've been much more we've been building homes for sale as well as a sector to cross-subsidise our affordable programmes, and that becomes impossible in a downturn. There isn't that cross-subsidy. So our one ask would be, investment in social rent from grant.
And John, sketch out to me here the kind of planning system that you envisage. Well, is it a kind of zonal system where, as in the white paper, where in certain places, any development that is in line with the aesthetic of the area would get automatic permission to be built? Is that the kind of system you think we need to solve a problem?
So there's no doubt that having more certainty in the system, that everyone can know what's going to happen and what's allowed, would be better. But a zonal system doesn't necessarily get you all the way. So you still have the question of what you're going to zone and where. 40% of the buildings in Manhattan you couldn't build today because the current zoning will prohibit it. So you've still got this question of what you're going to allow. For me, you published a piece on the Spectator website a month ago which sort of outlined this idea of if you gave local control to residents on very small scales, a single street or a single block, and they can work out for themselves what designs are acceptable, what they can all live with, and they can allow gradual addition of density over time. That's a much more sustainable way of supplementing what's coming through in the existing system in a way that local people are actually happy with. And you can add enormous volumes of housing that way where it's most needed.
Brilliant. Well, look, all that is now left for me to do is to thank our speakers today, to thank Bob, Kate and John. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and to thank you all for your questions. It's slightly odd not to be able to look at you to say thank you, but thank you anyway. There are plenty more events to to come in the Spectator Alternative Conference. So this lunchtime, we're having a live recording of Coffee House Shots, and this afternoon we're having an event on the best way to get to net zero. So hope to see you back for some more of those events. But I would normally say if you could give our speakers a round of applause, but I shan't, seeing as I'm not sure they would hear you. But just express your thanks to our speakers, and thank you all so much for tuning in. Good night.